binding commitments for collaboration in future war. On the other side of Eurasia, Britain's other new subject, Japan, was poised to launch another war, this time against Russia. The Japanese emperor had signed an Anglo-Japan treaty in 1902, the central feature being that in the event of a Japanese-Russian war, Britain would prevent other European powers from aiding in Russia's defense. With the green light thus on, British banks had increased loans to Japan for arms and warship production. As the Entente Cordiale was being finalized, Japan launched a devastating sneak attack on the Russian naval station of Port Arthur, foreshadowing the Pearl Harbor attack 37 years later against the United States. By 1905, the Japanese war against Russia had achieved its objective. The Russian nation was crippled. Only one capital ship remained in its navy. The resources of the country were exhausted. After the peace treaty, arbitrated by U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt, a revolution was run against the Tsar, further weakening his ability to govern. The optimistic vision of Russian leaders like Sergei Witte for a tramway of iron rail girding the world had been replaced by the bleak practicalities of war and British balance of power games. Shortly thereafter, King Edward bestowed the most noble British order of knighthood, the Royal Order of the Garter, on the Japanese emperor, an order so esteemed it was only possessed by the king and 25 knights around him. The summer of that year, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia met on a yacht in the Baltic Sea.
The Tsar feels a deep personal anger at England and the king. He called Edward VII the greatest mischief maker and the most dangerous and deceptive intriguer in the world. I could only agree with him, adding that I especially had to suffer from his intrigues in recent years. He has a passion for plotting against every power, of making a little agreement, whereupon the Tsar interrupted me, striking the table with his fist and saying, "Well, I can only say he shall not get one from me, and never in my life against Germany or you. My word of honor upon it."
Tsar Nicholas of Russia would not keep his word of honor for long. Within 2 years of this discussion, in 1907, the Tsar signed a war alliance with King Edward's Britain, arranging Russia in a triple partnership with France and Britain against Wilhelm's Germany, the very trap Nicholas had sworn to his cousin he would avoid. In the absence of Otto von Bismarck, no one remained to prevent King Edward's orchestration of a nightmare of coalitions for war. Coincident to arranging this series of horrifying developments, King Edward VII was maintaining perhaps the warmest correspondence between an English monarch and a U.S. president in history. Edward wrote Teddy letters about how the two of them had been placed in command of the two great branches of the Anglo-Saxon race, while Teddy responded that the real interests of the English-speaking peoples are one, alike in the Atlantic and the Pacific. As president, Teddy Roosevelt shut down McKinley's Pan American Rail project. He created East India Company-inspired conservation parks, denying settlers access to land intended by Lincoln for development. And he walked softly with a big stick all over the Monroe Doctrine, turning the U.S. from the leading enemy of empire in the Western Hemisphere to its leading friend. With the post-Civil War power of the U.S. thus chained to British interest, the last fateful steps to the ignition of war were lit in the Balkans.
What the British want to do is take an area where there's a confluence of division. You have Roman Catholic, Serbian, or the Orthodox churches. You have some Muslim elements. It's all the leftovers of the Ottoman Empire and the conflicts of the Ottoman Empire. And the British view is we can foment conflict virtually at the drop of a hat in these places.
In June of 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Ferdinand, rode through Sarajevo, Bosnia, and was assassinated by an anarchist. Predictably, the Austrians reacted by declaring war on Serbia. Tsar Nicholas II mobilized to defend the Serbs, and so likewise the German, French, and British entered the conflict. The Great War, whose fuse had been burning since King Edward's ouster of Chancellor Bismarck, went off.
Indeed, The war just started because the war started. There was no reason for this war to start. Everything was in place. There was a buildup of conflict. Every side was building up more of their military capability. Orders were going out. And at a certain point, the armies were on the move and nothing could stop them. And war broke out. But this was a British plan to set this in motion.
This is what happens when you have inadequate leadership. William II was a terrible emperor in Germany. Tsar Nicholas of Russia was an incompetent. The French government was incapable of addressing the broader strategic questions. They were all putty in the hands of the British manipulators. The British wanted World War I to destroy continental Europe. And you look at the incredible numbers of people who died on the battlefields fighting over a couple of square miles of land, and you see what a tragedy is about.
Really, the key to this is Europe is destroyed and demoralized. Because the idea is, how did this happen to us? We're supposed to be civilized, we have science, we have parliamentary democracies, we have culture, and we engaged in a meat grinder where people were slaughtered over inches of ground for 4 years, and nothing could stop it. And this is a war that was fought for no reason. People really know that.
In 1915, President Woodrow Wilson brought the United States into the war on the side of the British Empire. An avid Ku Klux Klan supporter, Wilson's election had been made possible by Teddy Roosevelt, who ran a third-party Bull Moose ticket in 1912, splitting enough votes from incumbent Republican William Taft to secure Wilson's victory.
Under somebody like McKinley or his successors, the U.S. probably would have stayed out. But under Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, both with a history tied to the Confederacy, the United States ultimately comes in on the British side. And it becomes a decisive factor.
The 24-year-long orchestration of World War I by King Edward VII thoroughly shattered the possibility of ending the British Empire. In Europe and Asia, each nation which had embraced the American system in the wake of Lincoln's assassination had been roped into destroying itself. In the United States, the Lincoln legacy was all but lost, with Woodrow Wilson closely tying the U.S. to support of British imperial interest for the post-war world. The British Empire itself, now more in control of world politics than possibly ever before, positioned itself to eradicate the potential for the Lincoln legacy to arise again by moving for the permanent eradication of sovereign nation-states. For this, the deceased Edward VII's policy of steering nations into self-destructive conflict with one another would be continued, but around new figures such as H.G. Wells, who had served as the director of British intelligence during World War I. Wells and his collaborators began immediately to sow the seeds for another great war, this one to wipe away nations and pave the way for world government.
Wells was a particularly nasty, evil, but very intelligent guy. And so in both his literary writings, his novels, his short stories, and then in his non-literary, non-fiction writing, particularly his Open Conspiracy, what Wells laid out is the idea that you have to create world government, world empire under British domination.
This is an independent sovereign state.
Yes, we must talk about that.
We don't discuss it.
We don't approve of independent sovereign states.
You don't approve.
We mean to stop them,
That's war.
if you will.
All right, I think we know how we stand.
The British foreign policy for Germany in the post-war period reflected the exact aims of Wells's policy. The Versailles Treaty of 1919, imposing nearly all of the post-war reparations on Germany, meant an undoing of all of Bismarck's previous successes, and a dissolution of Germany as a sovereign country. At gunpoint, the most productive agricultural lands and natural resources were seized. Ships, locomotives, and half of the nation's gold reserves were taken away. Social programs were eliminated, industries privatized, and vicious waves of speculation unleashed on the Deutschmark. The Reichsbank desperately printed mountains of currency in the vain hope of covering the unpayable debt, leading to the hyperinflation crisis of 1923. The British had finally reconquered Germany. In Southwest Asia, the same policy was pursued. Secret negotiations of the British Arab Bureau and French Foreign Ministry had created the Sykes-Picot Accord, which mandated British control of the Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq region, and French control of Lebanon and Syria. Still to this day, the manipulation of religious and ethnic tensions to create wars in this region echoes back to this repositioning of empire. In the United States, the same banks and cartels dismantling the German nation positioned themselves for similar actions against the already weakened American system. J.P. Morgan's bank, located at 23 Wall Street, had been established as the American arm of a British bank and steered as an insurrection into American finance since the 1860s. By the 1920s, the House of Morgan operated more akin to a cartel than a bank, with no public function and a board which reached into thousands of American companies, industries, and utilities. The hand of Morgan was known to be monarchical in the land of American finance, only subsumed in power by the British Empire he was acting for. It was this vast financial network which would take over the political parties, install a series of London and Wall Street-controlled presidents like Calvin Coolidge, and advise the dismantling of the American system. By 1928, John J. Raskob, a J.P. Morgan asset who had built his fortune through insider speculation, rose to prominence in the Democratic Party. Raskob lent the bankrupt Democratic Party more than $300,000, nearly erasing their debt. Raskob was then appointed chair of the Democratic National Committee, where he exerted powerful influence over the party's politics. Controlling things on the Republican side of the aisle was another J.P. Morgan agent, Thomas Lamont. Lamont was a financial liaison to both Imperial Japan and Mussolini's Italy. In 1925, when Mussolini's party was nearly bankrupt, Lamont came in with $100 million of J.P. Morgan money to bail him out. This same Thomas Lamont also provided daily consultation to the U.S. President Herbert Hoover. In October of 1929, the rampant speculation of the 1920s culminated in Black Friday.
It was the 1920 line collapse. And it collapsed amidst a period of dominated by euphoria. You can't beat the system. This is our system. Everything is fine. You can't beat the system. So like the boomers today, can't beat the system. Well, we go along with it. We go along with it. That's the system. We learn to live with the system. We learn within the system. We adapt to the system. We're going to be successful. We're going to make it.
The financial crash on Wall Street spread throughout the economy as a whole. And so you had not only massive unemployment through the collapse of the entire industrial and agricultural base of the economy, but you really were headed into the direction of real social despair bordering on social chaos.
Well, the shock was great. But then 1930, 31, 32, 33, it was a horrible nightmare for them. People, you'd see them, the crowds waiting on the soup kitchens to eat breakfast in Manhattan, lined up, dressed of people who had been considered themselves well-to-do in the previous time. Now they are with their top hats, their suits, and so forth. They're out there in the street, practically begging for a meal.
Look, this was a very dangerous period. This was the period when there was an effort by the Morgan interests to put a fascist government in power in France around Pierre Laval. This was the period of the Spanish Revolution when the fascist regime of Franco was put in. Hitler was in power. Mussolini was in power. There was a pro-fascist movement in Britain centered around Lord Beaverbrook, which was moving to take over Great Britain. And there were bankers on Wall Street who supported this, including the grandfather of our current president. Prescott Bush was working through the Harriman interests to fund Hitler.
Through these networks, and directed on the ground by Reich Bank President Hjalmar Schacht, millions of dollars were injected into the Nazi Party. By January, German President Hindenburg was pressured to put Hitler in as the Chancellor, and by February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building was set on fire by a Nazi Party member. The Nazis blamed this on the Communist Party and then used the fear inspired by the events as a pretext to give Hitler emergency dictatorial powers. The economic crash in the United States had snowballed into widespread hunger, bankruptcy, foreclosures, and 25% unemployment. People were not in a position to pay attention to the ominous rumblings abroad. Yet interest in the coming elections was unprecedented. Voters fervently hoped to find a leader who would, against all odds, turn them away from despair and restore the nation to prosperity. As the Democratic Convention neared, the Raskob-directed Democratic National Committee would go to extraordinary lengths to win the presidency. Their only opposition lay with a Democrat named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The party rules at the time were that the candidate to be nominated needed 2/3 of the delegates to win. Franklin Roosevelt had slightly less than that. Only a few states needed to join to his side, and he could win. The method that was plotted against him by the DNC was to keep the votes separate through as many ballots as possible until the delegates would break form and the convention might end up in a deadlock where the party would elect a compromise candidate of the DNC's choosing.
They had various candidates available, any one of whom would have been acceptable as long as it wasn't Franklin Roosevelt.
Their idea was that if they could string it out through 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8 ballots, that they could eventually convince supporters of Roosevelt that he couldn't make it, they should drop their support for him, and they could bring in a candidate acceptable to the Morgans.
To ensure none of the delegates broke for Roosevelt, his opponents created a chaotic atmosphere at the convention. They paid street thugs to come into the convention and boo any time Roosevelt's name was mentioned. They ran the media of the city to be anti-Roosevelt to create a fog of confusion. They even went to the extent of pressuring Roosevelt's delegates to break from him while they ate at restaurants and while going to their hotel rooms in the interim hours of the convention. Indeed, Roosevelt did not get enough on the first ballot, the second, or the third. In each vote he made only small gains. Campaign manager Howe and Roosevelt both knew that if at any point he lost votes, he would be out.
The fourth vote comes up, and Roosevelt's in direct communication with Howe and Farley, and basically their idea is they've got to get it on this roll call.
A mysterious telegram began to circulate at this point of the convention, a telegram intended to disorganize the Roosevelt delegates.
The way out of danger of a deadlock is not only open, but it is attractive. For all through these various delegations there is an astonishingly strong, though quiet conviction that the party can unite on a man who is stronger than any of the leading contenders. That man is Newton Baker of Ohio.
Roosevelt responded to this effort to demoralize his supporters by sending his own telegram from Hyde Park, New York.
I am in this fight to stay. This is a battle for principle. A clear majority of the convention understands that it is being waged to keep our party as a whole from dictation by a small group representing the interests in the nation which have no place in our party. My friends will not be misled by organized propaganda, by telegraphs now being sent to delegates. Stick to your guns. It is clear that the nation must not and shall not be overridden. Now is the time to make clear that we intend to stand fast and win.
The fight at the convention was not an internal Democratic Party struggle, but a conflict over whether the Lincoln tradition of American politics or the British system of empire would prevail in the world. Franklin Roosevelt knew this to be the issue of the convention. He knew this not as a recent discovery, but something which was fundamental to his thinking throughout his life.
In Roosevelt's case, it was a very explicit sense of history. Now, the earliest I can identify it is this paper that he writes on Hamilton, I think when he's about in his late teens or something like that. you know, it's clear that he does have a sense, like Lincoln, of being a continuation of the American Revolution, that his sense of identity is in the American Revolution. Now, I think it's very interesting, even though this is a very short paper, and obviously it's not a big scholarly exercise, it's more his own sense of who Hamilton was.
George Washington, the first president under the Constitution, made Hamilton Secretary of the Treasury, the greatest of the cabinet offices. As Hamilton had stabilized the problems of state, so now he ordered the finances of the country, and it was his impetus that removed for all time the risk of disintegration of the states. None appreciated this solidarity more than Aaron Burr, who, defeated for the presidency in his race against Jefferson in 1800, largely through the efforts of Hamilton, saw in this greater financial security the banishment of his dream of establishing a Northern Confederacy.
Roosevelt was aware, even in his description of Hamilton, that it was an American system, as he later refers to it, versus the British.
Roosevelt's great-great-grandfather was a close collaborator of Alexander Hamilton in the creation of the Bank of New York, of some of the strategy around the establishment of the First National Bank. Isaac Roosevelt was a great American patriot of that period. And his portrait hung in the dining room of the Roosevelt family home up in Hyde Park, New York.
So I think he had a very personal connection to the founding fathers, to, in particular, Hamilton, maybe because of his grandfather's ties to this. And it gives you a sense how somebody lives. Hamilton lived in Roosevelt. And that was his, I think, idea.
In 1920, Franklin Roosevelt, then only 38, had been selected by the Democratic Party as the vice presidential candidate. He stumped the country. Franklin visited 38 states and gave over 1,000 speeches. Franklin's policies were focused on the development of natural resources and improving the working and living conditions of the population. Amidst this momentum, Franklin contracted the life-threatening disease poliomyelitis.
At a critical moment in his political career, he had to drop out of politics and concentrate his every effort on battling a life-threatening disease.
Franklin and his family turned this period of illness and convalescence into a constructive period of his education into all fields.
There are times when I think that Franklin may never have been president if he had not been stricken. You see, he had 1,000 interests. You couldn't pin him down. Then suddenly there he was, flat on his back, with nothing to do but think. He began to read. He began to think. He talked. He gathered people around him. His thoughts expanded. His horizon widened.
He realized even more profoundly that it's the human being's mental capabilities, the human mind, that is who you are, and that's your strength. And if you rely on that, in effect, you can be the President of the United States, even though you're crippled. The physical side means nothing.
I saw Roosevelt only once, between 1921 and 1924, and I was instantly struck by his growth. The man emerged completely warm-hearted, with humility of spirit, and with a deeper philosophy. Having been to the depths of trouble, he understood the problems of people in trouble. He was young, he was crippled, he was physically weak, but he had a firmer grip on life and on himself than ever before. He was serious, not playing now. Politics had become important to him as a means to a good life.
Although not yet fully recovered from polio, these conditions led Franklin to run for governor of New York and to address the 1928 Democratic Convention.
Our people must not acquiesce in the easy thought of being mere passengers, so long as the drivers and mechanics do not disturb our comfort. We must be concerned over our destination, not merely satisfied that the passing scenery is pleasant to the eye. We must be interested in whether that national destination be heaven or hell, and not content that the man at the wheel has assured us that we shall find a full bank account and a soft bed. We do not want to change these United States of America into the United States Incorporated with a limited and self-perpetuating board of directors and no voting power in the common stockholders.
Once elected governor, Franklin began to reverse the ongoing economic disintegration by implementing policies of Social Security, unemployment insurance, major state infrastructure, job creation projects, regulation over utilities, and initial regulation of Wall Street. This prescription set a precedent for policy standards later and drew many protests against him from the Hoover administration.
I think it is time for us Democrats to claim Lincoln as one of our own. The Republican Party has certainly repudiated, first and last, everything that he stood for. Those in charge of the national government believed that individual and collective private action could restore the prosperity, and that the restoration of such prosperity is the sole objective.
By 1930, the Republican Party had become the party of financial speculation and free trade. In the midterm election of that year, the Democrats gained a majority in both congressional houses, and the next presidential election was expected to deliver similar results. Lewis Howe had planned a presidential bid for Franklin in the 1936 election, but the nation's economic conditions prompted an earlier run. Because of his success as governor in New York, Franklin was seen by many to be the likely Democratic Party nominee. To combat Franklin, early in the campaign cycle, John Raskob moved the repeal of prohibition into the forefront of the party politics. This issue was intended to create a wedge between the Northern and the Southern Democrats, and in a letter to the party published in early 1932, Raskob threatened that, were the party not ready to come together around this issue, the Democratic Party should break up and a third liberal party should be formed. Franklin perceived the true intention of these actions as an attempt by a financial elite to undermine the Democratic Party's chances in the election and retain control of the nation's economic policies.
I know that you will agree with me in believing that we face in this country the concentration of all power, economic and political, in the hands of what the ancient Greeks would have called oligarchy.
Going into the 1932 convention, you had people who were outright fascists and Nazis, who were the American equivalent of Montague Norman, Hjalmar Schacht, and the European bankers who wanted to install Hitler because they wanted a war in Europe. And so Roosevelt was facing those kinds of obstacles.
To combat this control from an elite few of the Democratic Party, Franklin invented the fireside chats in order to educate the population about the problems America faced and to muster support for his intended policy solutions.
These unhappy times call for the building of plans that rest upon the forgotten, the unorganized, but the indispensable units of economic power. Plans that build from the bottom up and not from the top down, that put their faith once more in the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid. It is high time to admit with courage that we are in the midst of an emergency at least equal to that of war. Let us mobilize to meet it.
In this situation, Roosevelt attracted especially the people in the lower 80% of family income brackets to the fact that he was going to do something for them. And we had a deeper cultural level in the United States, which is not British. People had an idea of a constitution, may not have been too clear on it, but they knew under our system that's not right. We don't do that to our own people. We don't let them starve. We don't let them suffer. It's not our way of doing things. So he could appeal to that sense of justice, of fairness, or sometimes called fairness, in the American population. And he got a tremendous base of support in it. He knew what he was doing. He knew the history. He'd laid the basis for what he did in his governorship in New York. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew what he was up against. He knew who the enemy was. And he knew that we were not safe unless we got rid of the British system.
This was the Franklin Roosevelt After earning a majority of the popular support during the primaries that came into the Democratic Party convention of 1932, a nomination of Roosevelt would mean the revival of Lincoln's legacy. A victory of anyone else would ensure an end of the United States.
Roosevelt came into the convention as the clear favorite of the American people, yet the party apparatus was dead set against Roosevelt getting the nomination.
Amidst the chaos of the convention, the Roosevelt apparatus persisted. Cracks started to develop among the different constituencies, and ultimately an American response came from the participants of the convention. Enough people realized that Roosevelt was the only alternative to the Wall Street Party, and that he was the only one committed and prepared to govern in the interests of the United States. A deal was brokered. The California and Texas delegations broke for Roosevelt, and he secured the nomination.
Franklin D. Roosevelt, having received more than 2/3 of all the delegates voting, I proclaim him the nominee of this convention for President of the United States.
Although this pleased the people in the convention, it did not please Raskob and his masters.
It seems unbelievable that the Democratic Party, born and bred in the fine old aristocracy of the South, and always fostered and nourished by a conservative people, such as Smith, P.S. DuPont, and myself, is now turned over to a radical group such as Roosevelt.
Hearing of his nomination, Roosevelt broke tradition, took a major risk at the time, and flew an airplane to Chicago in order to address the people of the convention directly and to draw the battle lines of his campaign.
There are two ways of viewing the government's duty in matters affecting economic and social life. One is to see to it that a favored few are helped, and hopes that some of their prosperity will leak through, sift through to labor, to the farmer, to the small business man. That theory belongs to the party of Toryism, and I had hoped that most of the Tories left this country in 1776. Our Republican leaders tell us economic laws, sacred, inviolable, unchangeable, cause panics which no one could prevent. But while they prate of economic laws, men and women are starving. We must lay hold of the fact that economic laws are not made by nature. They are made by human beings.
The power that parties get is significant. It's significant as a factor on the scene. But what's decisive is the leadership, which is always centered in one or two or more individual minds who are actually driving history in that direction with ideas, as Roosevelt did, with ideas.
By the election in November of 1932, Roosevelt won and was ready to begin his New Deal for the nation.
It looks, my friends, like a real landslide this time.
In Florida, 2 weeks before Roosevelt's inauguration, an anarchist emerged from the crowd and fired 5 shots at Roosevelt. The bullets intended for Roosevelt did not hit their mark, but undoubtedly Roosevelt knew, much like President-elect Lincoln before him knew, who his enemies were. On March 4th, 1933, Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated as the 31st President of the United States.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance. Yes, the money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truths.
So between Lincoln and Roosevelt, we didn't have an American president who was able to fundamentally transform the United States with this idea of the American system. Roosevelt understood this. He understood it from his studies of Hamilton. I'm sure he also understood Lincoln's policy very clearly, because so much of what he did was an echo of Lincoln.
Within hours of his first day in office, Roosevelt began a comprehensive reorganization of the nation's economy. Illustrative is the case of Chief Aide Harry Hopkins, who, armed with only a card table, a pot of coffee, and a telephone, hired 11 million Americans and spent $20 million in the first 3 hours of the administration. With the Civilian Conservation Corps, Rural Electrification Administration, the Four Corners Projects, and others, Roosevelt launched the largest peacetime mobilization of manpower and materials the world had ever seen. As an incredible example, the Tennessee Valley Authority transformed one of the most backward areas of the nation into an industrial powerhouse.
This was the plan: to chain the river through a series of giant dams, checking the flood. To open it to navigation from its mouth to its headwaters. To give the farmers the benefit of modern science and research. To help them control the water on their land and restore the fertility of the soil. To reforest millions of acres on the ravaged hillsides. To exploit the mineral resources of the area. To use the electric power generated by the dams to develop and rehabilitate industry in the cities. To electrify the farms through rural cooperatives. Above all, to prove that human problems can be solved by reason, science, and education.
Roosevelt used the Reconstruction Finance Corporation as a quasi-national bank to reestablish the credit of the nation. He built schools, libraries, airports, post offices, and all with government-issued credit. He reestablished the U.S. currency, stabilized the price of gold, and opened a penetrating investigation into the rampant speculation on Wall Street, all within the first 100 days of his administration.
But what he wanted to do was move immediately to stop the foreclosures, put people back in their homes, save the farms, build back farm income, and start up U.S. industry again. And to a large extent, he succeeded.
Policies that Roosevelt instituted for rebuilding the U.S. economy completely flew in the face of these powerful Wall Street and City of London allied interests.
By the middle of 1933, Roosevelt's attacks against free trade practices were tearing up the privatized control of the U.S. economy. As a desperate reaction to Roosevelt and his American system policies, one of the most outlandish British-directed plots in modern history was planned. J.P. Morgan's John Raskob was tasked to form a group to propagandize against Roosevelt's policies. This organization, becoming active in most cities and states, fervently attacked Roosevelt with thousands of speeches and millions of pamphlets distributed across the nation. The group was called the American Liberty League. The objective of the League was to become the eventual administrator of a 500,000-man force which would storm the White House and overthrow President Roosevelt. The plan was to then establish a dictatorship which would immediately enact the economic austerity plans of Hjalmar Schacht's labor camps already being applied in Nazi Germany. All they needed was a man with credit among the military legions to lead this coup. Unfortunately for them, the man they tried to seduce was a true American, retired General Smedley Butler. He knew the corruption of government and big business intimately from his past, and refused to succumb to playing the role of an American Hitler. General Butler contacted a trusted Philadelphia publisher, and by the time enough evidence was collected to substantiate the story, Butler took this plot to the Senate, and as the press hit the stands, the hearings began. The plot was exposed.
The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff or as a club at least, to intimidate the government and break down our democratic institutions. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government.
The defeat of this attempted coup was only another step in Roosevelt's re-establishment of the strength of the U.S. Constitution as a living principle of government. His response to the coup attempt was to further recruit the population to the approaching global war against fascism and poverty.
These economic royalists complain that we seek to overthrow the institutions of America. What they really complain of is that we seek to take away their power. Our religion and our allegiance to American institutions requires the overthrow of this kind of power. Against economic tyranny such as this, the American citizen could only appeal to the organized power of government. We well remember that the collapse of 1929 showed up the despotism for what it was. And the election of 1932 was the people's mandate to end it, and under that mandate, it is being ended. It is not alone a war against want and destitution and economic demoralization. It is more than that. It is a war for the survival of democracy. We are fighting to save a great and precious form of government for ourselves and for the world. And so I accept the commission you have tendered me. I join with you. I am enlisted for the duration of the war.
The story of the battles and the plans for World War II has been told over and over again. What has not been told is the story of the war between the American and the British system to determine the future